And here we go. It says you are live, and live we are. Hello, hello, everybody. Welcome to Raising Multilinguals Live on another sunny afternoon here. Brought to you near Montreal on my part. I'm Tetsu Young from Ask Tetsu, and let me send you to Europe.
Thank you. And I'm Uteli Riebelt from Ute's International Lounge, yes, from the Netherlands. Now, today we're very honored to have Professor Catherine McBride as our guest today, who will tell us more about how being multilingual can be a benefit for children with dyslexia. She's currently Professor of Human Development and Family Sciences and Associate Dean for Research for the College of Health and Human Sciences at Purdue University. She was previously the Choming Lee Professor of Psychology at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, as well as past president of the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading and founding president of the Association for Reading and Writing in Asia. She currently serves on the Scientific Advisory Board for the International Dyslexia Association, and she authored more than 250 peer-reviewed journal articles and is the editor of 6 books, 2 in press. She wrote Children's Literacy Development Across Cultural Perspective on Learning to Read and Write, and Coping with Dyslexia, Dysgraphia, and ADHD, A Global Perspective. Now,
it's funny that you said to impress. It sounded like to impress. Well, I'm impressed. That's a lot of literature.
Yes, it was to number impress. Now you see how quickly we can misunderstand something that we can say. Thank you very much for being our guest today, Kathleen.
Thank you. Pleasure.
If I may just jump in, not exactly, but maybe we can start with you telling us about your research focus areas and what drew you to focus on literacy skills in multilinguals with dyslexia.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's great to be here. One of the, I guess, the most important thing to say is I was always interested in the development of children's reading. That was what I did my dissertation on in the US. And then I got hired by the Chinese University of Hong Kong, where I was for 26 years. And when I arrived there, I had to figure out how to fit my interests, which had been for my dissertation on American kids learning English, into what would work in Hong Kong. And I'm a developmental psychologist. I'm not an educational psychologist. And what that means is I'm quite interested in lots of factors that relate to development. I'm hopeful that my research is useful in coming up with new strategies and new ways, new approaches for learning to read and write and helping kids with various disorders. But my main interest is just in describing development. And so it couldn't have been more different going to Hong Kong. All the developmental textbooks, because that's what I was teaching, would talk about reading and writing, maybe for a page or two. And they would say things about how children learn to read that just didn't fit in Hong Kong at that time. For example, they would say one of the most important aspects of learning to read is knowledge of the letters of the alphabet. But for learning Chinese in Hong Kong, that wasn't central. So I really got interested in that as a much more cross-cultural aspect. And so, I started my dissertation in looking at different predictors of reading, and I've continued that over the years. It's just that it's very broad. And I, at some point, got really interested in things like I would meet parents in Hong Kong who would tell me that they were switching their child from a local school where they were speaking Cantonese as I don't know what you call it, but a home language, mother tongue maybe, to an international school where the medium of instruction was usually English because it was easier. And that made no sense to me because all of us in developmental psychology know that your native language is what you should be learning in certain respects, or, the language that you're comfortable with. And a lot of these parents were describing kids who weren't that comfortable in English. So this was very, very interesting to me. And my research focus now continues to be cross-cultural literacy. I've worked with people in lots of different languages and scripts. I'm also more and more interested, for example, in online assessment and online training just because of COVID. But yeah, it's always been, and that's why I have these 2 books, one on development and one on severe impairment, that all focus on literacy across cultures, languages, and scripts.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's a fantastic start. I don't know which question I should ask. I already have like a gazillion already in my mind, but I love when different disciplines come together. Interdisciplinary. What I studied, biochemistry, and in my days it was biology and chemistry. Now you have developmental and the linguistic side that's really coming together in your situation. And on top of that, you were in a completely different pond, playing around in Asia. So you've got so many things coming together, and then you add on dyslexia. I think I'm not too sure if I really caught the focus on dyslexia, if that was in your explanation right now, other than languages and the developmental side. Where does the dyslexia come in?
Yeah, and I think that's an important question to explore in this forum, because language and reading are very, very different. And I don't think that adults really realize that, because if when you're reading something, it's almost the same as if you're speaking. But for young children, it's very possible to be completely interacting with the world and not be able to read and write at all. And so it's true that the word dyslexia attracts a lot of attention and people get very interested in that. Whereas reading development, people just think, well, that's just a normal thing. But everybody knows somebody who's dyslexic. And so, when I started out, it's variability in reading and writing. So dyslexia, and we can talk more about that. It's not one definition fits all. It's at the word level. It's not at the comprehension level. It's really reading and writing of words that I'm particularly interested in. But yeah, the way I got interested in dyslexia was because I'm interested in development. And those with dyslexia are on the low end in reading development.
Yes.
Do they say dyslexia is on a spectrum like they do with autism? Is that like a?
I think that's fair to say. I think so. For the book that I wrote in 2019 on dyslexia, I interviewed people in, I don't remember, 20 countries or something, to try to figure out how similar and different our concepts of dyslexia are. And basically, dyslexia can be defined in different ways, and it very much is. Even, for example, within the United States, you will find a lot of different ways to assess it and try to understand it. And if you go across countries, it's very, very different. Yes.
Yes. And we're going to talk about this in a moment, but also when you go in countries that have different scripts, right? There as well, there is a huge difference. But maybe we can really focus now on dyslexia, right? So can you maybe tell us what are early signs of dyslexia? And then also, are there different signs for multilinguals and for monolinguals when it comes to dyslexia?
Yeah, sure. So it's at least in Chinese and English and several other, for example, Indo-European languages, we know that there's, for example, a 50%-ish overlap between early language delay in some way and dyslexia. So one aspect of dyslexia, or one thing you might explore if your child's been quite delayed in language development, is the possibility of dyslexia. But usually, I think a better definition really focuses on phonological processing, in particular phonological awareness, being able to perceive different speech sounds differently and sort of manipulate them. So, but in different places, you'll have different tasks. They all revolve around something like dividing words into syllables, or being able to identify well-learned symbols quickly. Like if you were to see some blocks of color, oh, well, color is difficult. Some blocks with a simple picture, like ball, dog, sun. And for kids with dyslexia, they tend, even though they know those words, they tend to be much slower in identifying those pictures or being able to articulate them. And some people talk about also a little bit impaired verbal memory. So those are the things that really emerge across languages. Yes. And of course, it's not very easy to figure that out in multilinguals, because one of the things we know about multilinguals is at the beginning, language development in each language is a little bit slower, and you catch up, but it takes a while. So really being able to figure out, well, is this just normal? Because this child is learning all these languages. We don't have good measures to say, like, this is what happens for multilinguals. And just historically, I think dyslexia was sort of identified in Germany and highlighted in Germany. But then I think Anglo-Saxons sort of took it over for a while in terms of being really interested in it and exploring it a lot. And this is problematic, because in the UK, Canada, the US, Australia, there are definitely a lot of people who are multilingual, but it's not as common, for example, as in the rest of Europe or in Asia or Africa. And so we know lots about English-speaking dyslexics, but how that relates to multilinguals is still something that we are really doing a lot of research on intensively right now. I think it's catching up now, but it hasn't been a big focus in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and as we are talking about multilinguals here in this show that we have, multilingual children, and I think also of one of your articles, I think it's from 22, Dyslexia in Asia. You mentioned that more than 50% of the world's population learns to read in a language that is not the child's mother tongue or mother language, first language, home language, however you want to call it, which seems less a problem when the scripts are more or less the same or very similar. But when then you focus on Asian languages or the situation in Asia, learning to read in a language that we don't speak, for example, is already difficult enough. But if you then add also the difficulty of dyslexia, when we talk about different scripts, it makes it even more complex, right? Mm-hmm. So the next question, if I may ask, are there distinct patterns in the prevalence of dyslexia across the languages? So,
well, different people will answer this differently. So since I'm not a practitioner, I don't have things that I'm trying to sell you, and I'm not a government official, my opinion is that it's a normal distribution. Word reading is a normal distribution, mm-hmm. just like everything else. So you think about people's weight. Some people are very overweight. Some people are extremely thin and emaciated. Most people are in the middle. And so really it is a normal distribution. So you can look at that in relation to reading in any language or script. Now, there are differences, though, even in how we measure that. So, for example, in German, so I've tried to learn a little bit of German, and I think German grammar is extremely difficult. However, we're not talking about language. We're talking about word recognition. And if you think about German just in terms of looking at how things are spelled and then how to read them, German is very, very regular compared to English. So, you know, a particular letter or letter combination will almost always have the same sound in every word you see. This is not the case in English. Mm-hmm. And so what is the consequence of that? The consequence is the way we actually measure dyslexia in English even in 10-year-olds, can be just to give them words and see how they perform, and non-words. And it doesn't have to be timed, because kids with dyslexia in English will simply have trouble with those. However, in German, once you're in 2nd or 3rd grade, most children, even with dyslexia, can read the words. It's just that they're much, much slower. So there's an emphasis not just on difficulties, but in particular on fluency. And fluency is a very big deal. And then the other thing I would say is, if you're looking at scripts beyond, alphabetic scripts, and Chinese is just, I think, the most extreme, because it has so much variability in it in terms of visual aspects. You will kind of start to realize, even if you don't know any Chinese at all, that, even just looking, if you look at English or Chinese, there's a phonological aspect, speech sounds, how much the speech sounds the letters fit with the speech sounds. For example, the word pneumonia starts with a P. Why? That doesn't make any sense. You don't hear that P. Or no, K-N-O-W. It's not pronounced the way it looks. But there's so there's a phonological aspect, and there's also a visual aspect. And so in the 2 examples I just gave you, pneumonia or no, K-N-O-W, when you look at them, you sort of have to do some visual orthographic processing. And even if you're naive to Chinese, you've seen Chinese characters, you know that these also look visually quite distinct. And so there's a lot of visual aspects that you need to take into consideration. So in some languages, like Spanish or Italian or German, there's a lot of regularity there. And so it's mostly an emphasis on the phonological and the learning of the letters at the beginning. Whereas in other languages and scripts, and English is one of the ones, it's probably the most difficult alphabetic one, because it's the least consistent, but Chinese is a better example. Arabic is a good example. Some Akshara scripts, like they use, for example, in India or Pakistan, are much more visually complicated. And so those are different. The emphasis, it's always the same aspects. Is it phonological, morphological, which is focused on meaning, or orthographic, which is focused on the look of the words? But the weighting will be different. It will be much more phonological in alphabetic scripts, more visual orthographic in some other scripts, such as Chinese.
So you mean there will be more phonological problems when it's phonological. It would be phonological issues if it's something like English with lots of exceptions, lots of irregularities. Whereas it could be more morphological if it's something that is consistent but difficult in I forgot what the other issues were.
Sorry, I mentioned morphology because that's meaning. And so when you think of any way to read, you've got the sound on the bottom. Everybody can perceive sounds. Even if you don't speak Russian, you'll hear Russian sounds different from English. That sound, on top of that is meaning, and on top of that is script. And the middle level is morphology. And morphology is important as well, but I really wasn't emphasizing that here. I'm mostly distinguishing the speech sounds, how does it sound and how's that mapped onto the symbol, versus visual orthographic, which is how does the whole thing look.
So if I understand you right, so if we have the complexity of the languages, and we know maybe the child is dyslexic, let's hypothetically put it that way, we can assume that a child that is learning now at school, we're talking about a child at school, maybe also earlier, if the child is exposed to English or a visually more challenging language with signs or with the orthography, with the spelling, etc., that is more complex, like in the more less transparent, more opaque languages, like you mentioned before, then we can assume that the child will have struggling more with these languages when starting to read. Or
Could be.
could be.
But what I would say, which I think is quite a practical consideration, is that even if a person is dyslexic, we have different strengths and weaknesses. So it's good to know what your strengths and weaknesses are. So phonology may be weak or stronger, and visual orthographic may also be weak or stronger. So the reason I kind of made that face is when I think about Hong Kong Chinese children, there were some who really, are quite okay at reading Chinese characters, but really terrible in reading English, which is more a phonological focus because of the speech sounds being more regular. But even more striking to me was the opposite. So you had kids learning to read Chinese and they were terrible. They were really struggling. They were clearly dyslexic. But in English, they were fine. They were doing well because it made sense to them, the speech sounds and how to map those. So there are differences.
Yes, and I think I would like to quote someone who is following us. That's Roger Broadbent. Thank you very much for the question or for the comment. There are so different levels of severity of dyslexia. So I think we didn't point this out yet. But dyslexia is not like black and white. There are a lot of gray areas that need to be found out. And we're going to talk about this when we talk about assessment, right?
But the way I'm hearing this from Catherine is that I think this studies on dyslexia within this context here across multilingualism is most likely still at its infancy. And so because I see how you attack the problem, is still quite complex. There's so many angles to it. And I sort of wonder if researchers are trying to simplify like one aspect and like attack just a part of the problem more in pieces. I don't know if I'm explaining myself correctly here, but because now we have morphology, we have phonology. It's within the same realm. It's already two aspects within the same problem that I find that if you want to classify dyslexia within one of it, you could see a certain distinct pattern. If you look at it from the other aspect, then you see another distinct pattern. But now it's in like one bowl, right?
Yes. So one thing that I want to point out about dyslexia and the original definition is that it is the way it's defined is you're okay. You've had an okay background. So the teaching that you've received has been okay. Your IQ is within the normal range, although that's controversial. But you don't have any sensory deficits like visual problems or auditory. And yet you have a real problem in reading. And typically the definition is you have this problem in your native or comfortable home language. So when we get into, even talking about dyslexia and multilinguals in different scripts is a little complicated because typically we have one language we're more proficient in or comfortable with. And so this term dyslexia, again, all people know it. They think it means different things. But to a multilingual, I don't know that the word dyslexia is the best word because, for example, from my time in Hong Kong, all those kids in Hong Kong learn to read in English, which is just a school language for many of them, at 3.5. They're learning every day from the age of 3 to the age of 16. But they're not using the language on a regular basis. And so it's another layer of complexity because you want to, it isn't necessarily dyslexia. It could be just, motivational or background knowledge, resources related to learning a second or foreign language.
Yes.
Yeah. But apart from that, yes, there are other complexities as well. So I think there's a huge contingent in Europe that looks at different Indo-European languages, and they have reached certain conclusions, which I would say are very helpful, but do not capture some of what goes on in, say, China, Taiwan, or India, because there are very, very different scripts that are used. And so that is a different, another level of complexity.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yes. And then if you are in the situation and you have a child that grows up somewhere outside of the language that you speak at home, in another context, and the child is assessed at some point, I would like to come to the next question, actually, because I think it's okay to ask it now. How can then teachers screen the children about dyslexia if you don't have immediate access to the resources? Let's say there is a child, yes, in Paris, schooled in an English environment, but maybe the parents come from completely other places than France or England or an English-speaking country. How can then teachers screen these children in order to be fair to assess also their whole skills that they have? And how can they access?
It's a great question, and it's tricky. So I have one of the things that I'm most interested in my own research is in trying to capture word reading and who's low and high in it across the world. Because I think we always have these problems. And so if you think about reading as a normal distribution, if you find somebody who's, you know, for their age level or knowledge level, reading at the 1st or 5th percentile, you can be pretty sure that there's some dyslexic elements. And maybe at some point later, I can ask you to flash this test that we have. It's 10 minutes and we've got data on like 2,000 people, but that's just to scratch the surface. A problem with most of the tests that you'll see is that they're normed really for that population right there. And there are so many differences, even among Chinese speaking people in Singapore and Taiwan and even different cities in the mainland. It's not the same. The context is different. I would say if teachers are very interested in finding out if the child is dyslexic, I would start, in your case, with trying to give them some games. I don't know if you've ever heard of a game like Pig Latin, where you take the first letter of a syllable and you make it into an A. So like if you take the word pat, it would be at pay, or cook would be ook, something like this. If children can manipulate syllables or reverse them, how would you say cowboy the opposite way? So the second, if you can explain it to them, so you have to work on the language. And if they can say boy cow instead of cowboy, those kinds of things. If this child really has a lot of trouble with those phonological aspects, I would say they're at risk. I would also say from our own research in Hong Kong, kids who have trouble with this task that I mentioned before, where you show like just pictures of common objects, sun, shoe, you know, ball, things that all kids can label. If they're particularly slow in that, at least in Hong Kong, we found that the kids who were having the most trouble reading were the slowest in that task. And it didn't matter much which language it was in because it's so well learned.
And it wasn't due because they didn't know the objects, because they were everyday
we
objects.
Always test them.
Yes, yeah. So that is also something that actually when you grow up in another country, or you just move to another country, you might not know how a kangaroo looks like, or you know, some simple objects that everyone thinks it's something that all children of your age must know, but maybe not in those contexts.
That's right. But probably the best test, those are for very young children, but the best tests are just for like single-digit numbers or letters. They should be very well-known graphemes.
Yes, and I think it's very important also to point out that at that point when the children are assessed, and also the parents should be asked how the child is reacting to these signs, etc. If they can recognize things in the in pictures, and if they can name them in the home languages as well, in order to have a more precise picture of what is going on, or maybe it's not going on. It's maybe only because the child is learning the new language, right? So this. We have a question. I hope it's okay if we ask it here before we proceed. It's from Yoshito. Hi, Yoshito. When talking about children in Hong Kong, it refers to what you said before. You said that they could read without problem because the orthography made more sense. Can you explain what you mean by that? Does it mean that if the logic of writing a language seems logical to a person, they can read?
Sorry, yeah, that was very imprecise language. I think that some of the Hong Kong children found that just 26 letters in the alphabet of English is pretty simple to master. So P usually sounds like P. Sometimes it doesn't. There's some exceptions, but maybe 80% of the time you can map L to the sound L. And so the logic behind the sounds of these 26 letters and their different combinations was much easier to master than for, just thousands of characters in Chinese. I will say also, because this reminds me of a study done by a professor named Tycho Weidel. She's in the UK, and she and her colleagues in Japan looked at reading of different scripts, and they found that if you were comparing two scripts that were both mapped onto the same language, which is rare, it's not very common to do this, the kanji, which is sort of like characters, like the Chinese characters, were much more difficult to master than the more phonologically regular script. So often for children, if it's a limited set of symbols, they have an easier time.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Put it here. We mentioned before, yes, that we can also transfer, or we know that we can transfer, or the children can transfer skills that they learned in the school language to the home language, and vice versa, since the studies of Jim Cummins. Does this also apply for children with dyslexia, or where are possible problems with this transfer to watch out for?
So phonologically, I think there is a lot of transfer. Mm-hmm. So if you're good at manipulating speech sounds, even if they don't have any meaning to you, you can transfer that easily to another language. And we can see that also in languages as different as English and Chinese. I think
That's
more. Yep. And then in the middle level, morphology. One of the things we've done in our studies has to do with compound words. And compound words are the norm in Chinese. They're probably the norm in other languages. I mean, they're definitely the norm in, for example, German. Yes. Yes. They're much, or Dutch.
Dutch as well.
They're much less common in English. And so that's one interesting thing we found in a commonality between German, Dutch, and Chinese is this compounding. And one of the best indicators of dyslexia in Chinese is the inability to do compounding. So, for example, if I were to say something like, when the sun sets at night, we call it a sunset. What would you call it if the moon were to set? And you would say moonset. Or you're making up a word that doesn't exist based on morphemes that you know. This is a great indicator of dyslexia in Chinese. It's also easily transferred to English. So we find that Chinese kids tend to be pretty good at understanding compound words across Chinese and English. I think the reading skill that is least transferable is orthographic. So if you can recognize letters, that's not going to help you too much in recognizing Chinese characters. And in fact, maybe it's a problem in some way. So and I'm sorry to talk about Chinese so much. It's just that we've done the most research in that. But also, I think that the distinction between Chinese and any alphabetic orthography is pretty big. So it's an interesting contrast. But for example, in Chinese, there are many homophones. So you just say one syllable. It doesn't matter if you're phonologically good. You don't know how to write it. There could be 10 choices. That's not really true in most Indo-European languages. And so you've got to look for something else. So the visual orthographic part is going to be very strong in Chinese. And it's important for some other scripts, but not as important. So yeah, the phonological, luckily, because if you're really concerned about your child having dyslexia, I would start with the phonological. And so if the child has trouble manipulating speech sounds in whatever language, that's some indicator.
Yes, absolutely. That's very helpful to know. I have another question now that is related also to, yes, when and which language actually to start reading in. And this comes also from what parents who maybe are dyslexic themselves, and I think maybe their children might be dyslexic. This is an aspect that we didn't point out yet, or we didn't mention, but there is a higher probability that maybe the child is dyslexic as well, or one of the children when they have more than one. But what I came across quite often with parents who have dyslexia was which language should we start reading with our children, or which actually language should we choose the school in order to help our child to start reading in a language that is, I wouldn't say easier, but that is also easier for the child, the parents to help the child. Yeah, if let's say if the parent is German and the child grows up in Portugal, and they are thinking of sending the child to a Portuguese school or an English-speaking school, where do we send the child if there is maybe some doubt if the child might be dyslexic, etc.? So what about languages with different scripts? Now we were talking about this, but with which language should children actually with dyslexia or with suspect of dyslexia start reading?
Well, I think the simple answer is the one that's the simplest to map. And again, I know this might sound really silly on this particular forum because everybody must know this, but maybe not. When we're talking about dyslexia, we're talking about word recognition. We are not talking about complexity in languages. We're not talking about grammar, in meaning. We're just talking about mapping symbols to words. And so there has been research, especially in Canada, a little in the US as well, with kids who come from different backgrounds, and those who are dyslexic, but in a regular orthography that's very phonologically transparent, like Spanish, they tend to do better in, for example, learning English to read English. I mean, it's not always the case, though, that everybody learns to read in more than one language at the beginning. I think probably as a developmental psychologist, I would say focus on the communication and the language part, because there's this concept of evolutionarily primary and secondary abilities. So evolutionarily primary abilities are those that, well, if you think about evolution, language is for communication. That's why we do it. We do it in order to communicate with somebody else. It helps us get our way, etc. Secondary abilities kind of derive from primary abilities, but they are much more effortful. They're not natural. So primary abilities are kind of natural. Secondary abilities are not. Reading is a secondary ability. It's effortful. Almost no one learns to read without a lot of hours of practice. And this is an important distinction, especially if you have, say, a much stronger language and a weaker language. And again, I'm going to come back to Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, some kids speak English really well, a lot because their parents speak some English, or they might have a helper at home. This is very common in Hong Kong who speaks English. a lot of things happen that they're going to an English speaking school. So they're using English to communicate. But the majority of Hong Kong Chinese children are simply learning it as another class. They don't really like it necessarily. It's not fun. They're just learning to spell C-A-T as cat. But they're not using it for the purpose that we think of language for. And that makes it more frustrating and annoying. And so I would say this is a great question, but think about whether your child really does need to learn to read in several scripts at the beginning. I would just focus on one. And if you have a choice, go for the phonologically regular one. Okay,
great. That's a very good good answer for many. I'm sure that there's we made the right choice in many cases.
And perhaps I'll put up a comment from Roger, which is kind of in line here. She was talking. So Catherine was talking about Spanish being I guess it's a phonetically, very simple, language.
It's transparent
and quite transparent and regular. So he's asking whether Spanish Americans would have increased childhood trauma, I guess, due to dyslexia. Was this maybe less? I guess it would be the answer in this case.
Yeah, it's funny because there are many different aspects that contribute to this. And in this case, if you have two dyslexic kids, one who's monolingual English and one who's Spanish English in America, I would say the Spanish English child is going to do somewhat better, at least in this narrow definition of word reading. Yeah. It's an interesting question.
Very, yes. Thank you for asking it, Roger.
Yes. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Yoshito, and everybody who's following us right now on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Shout out to everybody.
And I would like to come to the core question, maybe from today, that was also put on the banner, right? When can actually being multilingual be beneficial for people with dyslexia, and when not? So when is knowing several languages actually going to benefit the person with dyslexia?
I think multilingualism, first of all, primes children to understand that there's more, that it's not the case that an object is its name, that there's flexibility there. I mean, there are lots of people who've talked about how multilinguals are flexible. There's some controversy, but I think there's some evidence that for young children, we see them being much more flexible and understanding that, this word in one language, it's a totally different word in another. And this is the flexibility. And so they don't internalize so much that, like this symbol of B can only be a B and there's no other way to think about it. So I think the flexibility is helpful even with dyslexia. Again, I also want to emphasize that dyslexia is a very narrow kind of disorder. This is something I'm glad to have the chance to say. If with all the technology we have these days, it doesn't have to be a problem. Text to speech. I mean, when I was interviewing teachers and parents, it could be kind of almost a non-issue. But schools really make it a big issue that if you can't spell well and you can't read fluently very early, you are at a disadvantage because schools really value that. And so I think multilingualism is just beneficial because it gives kids flexibility, and because there's often some transfer. So if you learn to read first, like we said before, in a more transparent language / orthography or script, then that'll be of benefit to you as well. The last thing I would say is, I mean, if you are in a situation like in Hong Kong or in a lot of India, where you're really reading two very different scripts, it's possible that, you are weak in phonological skills, for example, but you're pretty good in visual orthographic. So you can use a strategy that you're using in one script to master the other one. There's an interesting study in Canada where Chinese children, mostly who'd come from Hong Kong, that's why I know about it so well, were better at spelling in English than the Canadian native kids were. Because the strategy in Hong Kong has been, at least traditionally, quite a bit of memorization, visual orthographic memorization, not so much an emphasis on the speech sounds, but on visual orthographic aspects. So if you've come from that tradition, you can, go back and forth between the phonological and the visual.
That's very interesting. Would that mean that certain ways to teach languages, of course, depending on what kind of language is taught and what the system is, what the script is, are more an advantage for someone with dyslexia?
Yeah, I think that there's some of that. Maybe, for example, the English-speaking kids, if they were learning Chinese, they do better. You don't want to take that too far.
Okay.
But
I just I was wondering
Maybe
about
the silver lining.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. But what you were saying about flexibility, it really makes sense. And also having a broader repertoire of sounds and recognition and words that we can attach to things around us when we are multilingual, it gives that kind of an advantage, maybe, that can be then the beneficial effect of, for also with the children with dyslexia.
It may cue you also to different strategies. Like in some languages, there's, for example, stress. Like you say sofa instead of sofa. But in Chinese, there's not stress, but there's lexical tone. And so different things, you learn different strategies and different aspects. And maybe that improves your toolbox for helping you to learn.
Yes, I once, when I talked with someone about dyslexia, and she described it like, it's like having to run or being a hurdler and not seeing the hurdles, and having to find strategies to not, get hurt during the run. So these strategies, if I understand well, they can be very, very different and very varied across languages and across the different things. So there is not one solution that fits all, or not one way that would accommodate all languages that the children are exposed to. It's very important to know. Yeah.
If I can take a minute, this is my book, which is about coping with dyslexia and dysgraphia, and in it, I interviewed some people, and one of my favorite interviewees is a person with dyslexia, dysgraphia, and ADHD who became a translator, because I was sort of obsessed with this idea that, so for example, at Yale University, there's a famous professor named Sally Shaywitz, and she and her team have recommended that if you are dyslexic, you do not need to take a foreign language at university. And I was always interested in this perspective because it seems quite American to me, because in most of the world, it doesn't matter if you're not good at it, you have to do it anyway. And like learning English as a second language is often something that is just a must in many places in the world, and also many other languages. So I was curious about this idea. If you're dyslexic, does that mean not having to learn another language? And my translator interviewee was saying, well, they're just so different. Learning the language is very different from learning to read. And so you really have to distinguish them. And there's some research that backs that up as well.
Absolutely, yes. It's a very good information for everyone, for teachers, for educators, for medical doctors as well, who might be giving some suggestions that are a bit hindering the development of the child instead of actually supporting them. And the next question, what tips would you actually then give parents of multilingual children with dyslexia when talking about this? Maybe summing up the ones that you just mentioned.
Yeah. Well, the first tip I would like to give as a developmental psychologist is focus on children's strengths. One of the things that came through to me the most, it's the least researched, but I think it's possibly the most important, is that in a lot of societies, there is a focus on dyslexia as a deficit. And in childhood, that's all you get. You're bad at this. You need to improve. You should spend more time and effort on this. And I think that is a real problem with just like forming a self-identity. I think multilingual children should be very proud of all the languages that they speak, and focusing on print and reading and writing it is important. It's only as important as, you know, your educational goals and what the school expects, but there are also ways to deal with it. If the child's really spending lots of effort and not making a lot of progress, there are workarounds that you should consider. So that is something I would say, because I think a lot of people, you know, are really dedicated to having their children be high achievers and working on their difficulties. And those with dyslexia, sorry, they can learn to read. Almost everybody with dyslexia does learn to read eventually. They're slower, be worse at spelling. It just takes them a lot more effort. So pace yourself on that. And, you know, if children try to figure out what children's strengths and weaknesses are. If you think that your child maybe learns better, I don't think there are visual versus phonological learners, but there are strengths versus weaknesses in different strategies. So if you can find a strategy that children tend to do better in, try to emphasize that.
Yes, and maybe for parents also to get informed. I know many parents are very intimidated, you know, when you learn, okay, my child is struggling with reading and might be dyslexic, and then you have like the world is crumbling down on you, and you say, what can I do? Oh my gosh, where did I not see that sign before? Maybe when the child was much younger. And then you have all kind of things that you say, oh yes, this is why my child didn't manage to rhyme, for example, yeah, or do other things that other children seem to make no effort doing. But that's very important also, I think, to let parents know that they should be advocating for their children and get informed, and then insist also that the teachers or whoever works with the children actually, yes, fosters their strengths and doesn't say, yeah, you have a deficit of any kind. That's absolutely not what it is, right?
That's right. And I don't want to say people with dyslexia have special strengths. They may. I think whoever you are, you look at what your strengths and weaknesses are, and we're all unique. But I do think childhood has to be a time when we're figuring out all our interests. And so we need to work on what we're not good at, but we shouldn't. I mean, this may also come from Hong Kong or some other societies where there's so much time spent on homework. There's little time for self-development in any other way. The other thing I would say is, if you're worried about it, play silly language games. Yes. Do anything. Just try to say like, well, can you think of a silly word that would rhyme with this? You know, can you make up silly words? What would that mean? So those are metacognitive skills, thinking about thinking. And anything you can do that is sound-based or morphology-based is good. It's helpful.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Thank you. I would like to quote Ioannis Vrambosinos. Multilingualism gives dyslexic a confidence boost as they feel clever to be able to manage different languages, and is another example of how their brains work differently from monolingual friends or from others, maybe I might say. Yeah, it's a nice comment. Thank you very much, Ioannis.
Absolutely. Agree.
So
we also have Roger, who emphasized this, and while I was listening to you, it just feels like Uta and I, when we talk to parents, a lot of the advice that we give them is not just for multilingual kids or bilingual kids. It's actually just for all kids. And I feel like this one is right in there, focusing on kids' strengths rather than always trying to hit them on the head with their weaknesses. You know, as you say, there needs to be a good balance in the candy and the whip, I guess, analogy needs to balance out. So.
But yes, and I think this also a little bit sums up what we were trying to do today, as we have this perspective from a psychologist. point of view that
That's
I
right.
find very, very important when a linguist talks about this, a child psychologist talks about this, or someone else, an educator. I find they should all sit together and talk about the children, plus the parents, and if possible, also the children, so that everyone has a place at the table to discuss about these, the ways to strengthen the strengths, or however you want to call any other skills that they have, in order to make them grow in the most healthy way. Thank you so much for all your information and knowledge that you have shared with us today. But I would like also to ask you what you are focusing on now in your research. What are the next steps, or what can we look forward to reading from you?
Thank you. Well, I'm really interested in cross-disciplinary research. So I still have some research going on in Hong Kong where we're looking at genetics, like children's DNA and their brain, how their brains work through ERP, evoked response potentials, and then behavioral tasks, and looking at those in both Chinese and English. That's one thing I'm interested in. I'm interested in models of Chinese and characters versus words. And most of all, I'm interested in online assessment and prediction. And I got interested in that during COVID. I think that there are lots of people out in areas, different countries, rural versus urban settings, where they are concerned that their kids might have, say, dyslexia, something like this. And they'd like to get some assessment, and they don't know how. So traditionally, our assessments, at least in the US and the UK, are kind of expensive tests that you need a trained clinical psychologist to administer. And I'd like to work on a quick and dirty measure, something that would take about 10 minutes that could be administered online. So if you were to be able to, and that's the thing that if you could flash that, I'd be happy.
Yes,
this word sword, because we really want to just be able to look at a person and go, yeah, this person looks like they may need more in-depth assessment. And this particular measure is 10 minutes, and we have adults and children doing it, and anyone who has at least 1 year of English experience, native speakers, and also any kids learning in different countries. And so, because we really want to be able to develop a measure where, because so in so many places, knowing English as a foreign language is also useful for getting up into higher education and this kind of thing. So even though we can't call it dyslexia, if you're impaired in English in a different country, you're really having trouble, we'd like to be able to know that and figure out what to do about it. So those are my main interests right now.
Yeah, amazing. Yes, I shared the link, so it will be also in the description after the interview.
Oh, thank you very, very much. Eleanor also says, thanks, Cammie. So,
Eleanor, hi.
So
my good friend Eleanor.
An hour just flies by. I don't know if we've ever really been able to stay within the 40 minutes or so that we've always aimed for, but it just never happens because it's always so interesting and so enriching when we talk to the experts in our in the area. So Roger is asking, how much is the word sword?
Oh, it's free. It's just a test to try, and
the best price.
So
it's the best price. But
you're contributing to our data set, because we really want to be able to say, this is for a child who has had 2 years of English, this is the performance that would be normal, typical.
And would you mind putting up the name of your book once again?
Yes. I'm going to share it. I'm going to also share it. Yes, please show it. You can put it.
Yeah. Children's literacy development. And the one on dyslexia. This one is, I can't do this. This one is from 2016 and I'm updating it. This one is from 2019 and it's the one with the interviews that I was talking about today. Thank you.
That's great. Well, thanks again for sharing your expertise and sharing your time, which I always find is the most generous thing to share.
Yeah.
And thanks to all our viewers on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Thanks for joining in today. Just a little something from us, news from us, myself and Uta. Recently, we're working on different things for Raising Multilinguals Live, and some of you have seen we have a new Facebook group. If you're not in it, do find Raising Multilinguals Live Facebook page, and you can find the group, also Facebook group. And I think that's how we can share our time with you guys and our expertise. You can ask us anything you want, interact with us, and we'll be there in there periodically. And more programs to come, right, Uta? We're preparing a few things behind the scenes, and more activities coming up on Raising Multilinguals Live with more experts every month. So thank you once again, Catherine.
Thank
It's
you very
been
much.
most enjoyable. And once again, I will sleep a little more intelligent tonight.
We always learn very much. Thank you very much, Catherine, for taking the time and for shedding some light over a topic that is way too much not put into the light for many.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
Okay, so thank you to all our viewers from wherever you are. And Uta, it's late down in our area, so have a great rest of your day, the rest of your evening. And Catherine, rest of our day. We're still right in the middle of the afternoon. Okay.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Very soon, guys. Bye-bye now.
Alla prossima.
Sayonara. 再见.